It's so rare to see a company who'll give out a reference letter these days.
And why is that, Barry? Like, why not give a letter of reference? In the same way, why not give some working notice,
Because
right?
20 years ago, somebody gave a seminar, or there was some case in the US where somebody got sued for giving a false reference. You cannot be sued for giving an honest reference.
Welcome to Water Cooler Justice. I'm Chris Robertson. I've been practicing employment law for over 20 years, helping clients settle disputes and navigate challenges at work. We've been on summer vacation. I hope you've had a lovely time. I certainly did. And I'm excited to be back here now in the fall with a new season of podcast episodes. And today we'll be looking at a case called Kondaj v. Crossbridge. Barry Fisher is joining us again today. I think of Barry as the Dean of Employment Law. He's a mediator and arbitrator in Toronto. He brings over 30 years of experience as an employment lawyer and legal author to the show today. He wrote about this case on his blog, and we're looking forward to hearing his thoughts on this matter. We're also welcoming Rob Richler, a partner at Bernardi Human Resource Law, LLP. Robert has a wide range of experience as an employment and labor lawyer, both as in-house counsel and in private practice. He advises employers and employees on contract negotiations, terminations, wrongful dismissals, collective bargaining matters. He also conducts workplace investigations. I didn't know that. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So to get started, I'm going to take the listeners through the details of today's case. Unfortunately, Sarah is away today. She's in the great outdoors, communing with nature, petting all the animals, and having fun. But she'll join us for our next episode. Our case today is Kondaj v. Crossbridge Condominiums. Let's look at the facts. The plaintiff in this case is Gazmend Kondaj. He's 42 years old. He's been a condo manager for Crossbridge at the Soho Hotel and Residences in downtown Toronto, nice, for 3.5 years. In late November 2023, Crossbridge's property management contract with the Soho Hotel and Residence ends. It's taken over by another company called Duca Property Management. After Duca took over the contract, they informed Mr. Kondaj that his employment would end and terminated his employment without cause. He gets 3 weeks of pay in lieu of notice of termination under the ESA. Mr. Kondaj starts looking for new employment in Toronto, but it's a tough market, and it takes him 11 months to find a comparable position. Mr. Kondaj files a lawsuit against Crossbridge and Duca for wrongful dismissal. Rob, you had a great post about who the correct employer was, and I'm not going to sort of dig into that today. But Mr. Kondaj did have a written employment agreement with Crossbridge that contained termination provisions, but neither Crossbridge nor Duca disputed that the termination provisions were enforceable. So the contract wasn't really an issue here. It was a motion for summary judgment, and it proceeded on the basis that Mr. Kondaj had an implied right to reasonable notice of termination of employment under common law. So the judge had to determine two things: who was the employer, and again, I'll direct you to Rob's post. I think it's great on that. And B, what was the period of reasonable notice of termination that Mr. Kondaj was entitled to receive? And that's what I really want to focus on today. Is notice an objective award based on Bardolph factors to replace working notice that the employers routinely fail to provide? Or is it a bridge for the amount of time that it takes the employee to find comparable employment? And I think I'll let Barry start us off here because I thought Barry's post sort of dived right into this at the outset.
Oh, there's a third alternative, that the determination of notice is a crapshoot that depends largely on the particular judge and how he feels about the employer and the plaintiff that day. The toughest cases in the world to predict the outcome are short service, people less than 5 years. If this guy had 10 years of service and he was 45, there would be no dispute. It would probably be around 12 months, right? But the short and the long service cases are pretty easy to determine too. They're usually 24, but lately the 24 seems to bump up occasionally. These short service cases there's no other word for it. They're just a mess. They're just a complete and utter mess. And I'm not sure what the guidelines the courts use anymore are. What I found interesting here was, no, I mean, I spent, by the way, I've been doing this for more than 30 years. I read thousands and thousands of cases, and I think the biggest predictor of the notice period is whether if they describe the plaintiff as a married man with 3 children, the employer's lost. That's it. Toast. It's gone. If they if they start talking about his personal life, he's going to get a long notice period.
Yeah, the sympathetic
Yeah,
plaintiff,
yeah.
right?
If they refer to him as the plaintiff throughout, then you're going to do okay. What was interesting about this case is in paragraph 92 is what I focused on. He talks about, in my view, the cases the plaintiff relies will more accurately reflect the factors at play in this time, especially the downturn in the economy and the condo market. As noted, it took the plaintiff 11 months to find new employment. Although the amount of time it takes a plaintiff to find reemployment is not the determining factor, because it would place excessive weight on the plaintiff's subjective circumstances. At the same time, the underlying purpose of the common law is to give the terminated employees financial support. Blah 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 blah. Now, this has been recognized in other cases, especially where you have a small town dominated. Say you have a mining town up in northern Ontario, and the plant manager loses his job. Well, there's not a lot of mines in the same city, so it's always been recognized that the scarcity of jobs is a factor, probably the most critical factor. For instance, uh, like as I said, a nuclear scientist really has about 2 places to choose to work from. Where if you're a salesman, for instance, the court assumes you could probably sell anything. So I'm not sure this is that new. It's what I found interesting though was the evidence, if one can call it that, presented to talk about this condo situation. The evidence was that the condo market, they weren't building new condos. I get that. But this guy was not a construction manager. He was
Right.
managing existing condos. So I don't know to what degree, when you think about it, the fact that the condo market is not expanding would have an effect on whether condo management jobs are less. I just sort of throw that out. And so they had evidence that the condo market was poor, condo prices were dropping, and buildings weren't being completed. But I'm not sure there's a direct relationship between that, because whether a condo is selling for 1 million a square foot or 900,000 a square foot, you still need a condo manager. So I think he made a mental leap there. Um,
Okay. So I think that's right. I think, Barry, I hear you're leaning towards this availability of alternative employment factor, and you're questioning the evidentiary basis. But Rob, in your post, what I noticed was, you had a comment along the lines of, how is an employer supposed to know what notice to give if it isn't an objective analysis? And I want to hear some thoughts from you on that.
Yeah, Chris, I think it's a great point. And I do a lot of work with both employees and employers. But when an employer comes to me and they have someone who they want to separate with for whatever reason, they want to know what's the right amount that we should be paying this person. And a decision like this, makes it very difficult to make that analysis at the front end. I mean, if you go to Barry's database, I wonder how many people in a similar situation are going to have 10-month notice periods. And to touch on what Barry said, I think a more appropriate thing for the judge potentially to look at is how many jobs are out there. And it's not like this was a market with no available jobs. This guy applied to 170 roles over 11 months. That's like, I
Right.
did the math. That's like basically a job per weekday he's applying to. That's not a market with no jobs in it. There's roles out there. Unfortunately, he's not getting that. But looking at it as an employer ahead of time, there's a job that a guy can apply to every day. We're not thinking it's going to take him almost a year to get a new job. We're going to think he's probably going to get one relatively soon. So maybe I think they said 2 to 4 months is the appropriate period, the defendants. I don't think with a guy that's been there for 3.5 years that they're going to get those questions that someone who's been with the company for 8 months is going to get as to why was it so hard to, or why were you fired, and got a great explanation. There was new owners. They didn't want to keep me on when it came through. So a lot of those concerns that you get with short-term employees that generally drive the notice period up aren't there here. He can go into any job interview and say, this is why I don't have the same job. And it's a position that a prospective employer is going to understand. Now, they didn't help themselves by not giving him a recommendation letter, but
Correct.
but it's not like when you look at it, there was no jobs out there for him to apply to.
But you don't know that, Rob. You're assuming that he applied to 170 vacancies. That's not how people look for jobs. They cold call. He may have written 100 letters. That's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to wait for an ad. You're supposed to dig it out. So he may have written to every condo company in the world saying, "Do you have a job?" So I don't think you can, because it sounds now like you're punishing him because he looked hard. If he looked hard, therefore there must be jobs. I can rest assured that as employer counsel, if he hadn't looked, you'd say, "Oh my God, there were lots of other opportunities out there."
100%.
Well, so I've got an idea here that I want to float out, and maybe you guys can give some comments back. I think that the likelihood that the employer gets a lower notice period based on objective Bardol factors is higher if they offer working notice than if they choose to terminate, pay ESA minimums, refuse to provide support in the job search, and then argue mitigation at trial. Right? Is there an element here where, if a reasonable employer had made a reasonable offer that one, Kondaj maybe accepts, so there's no litigation, but two, if there is litigation, a judge, when they're looking at this file, starting from the position of you were given 4 months working notice and a letter of reference, do you think that Mr. Kondaj still gets 10 months?
I think you made 2 points there. I don't think an employer. I'm sure an employer cannot rely on an offer. That it's commonly pled, but I think it's fundamentally wrong. Offers are not admissible.
But working notice too, Barry, right?
Actions, and you switch. That's why I'm correcting. So
Yeah.
if this employer had turned around and sought legal advice and said, "Well, the notice period is probably going to be at least 3, and it might be as high as 6. Why don't you give the guy 3 months working notice?" But they don't want to give. Nobody wants to give working notice. They don't like this guy. They want their own guy. Just pay him 3 months. Don't offer to pay him 3 months. Pay him 3 months. Now, what does that mean? First of all, the guy probably, unless he's been watching these broadcasts and everything, he's going to think, well, that's probably fair. He's going to call the Ministry of Labor and they're going to say, "Hey, buddy, you got a lot more money than you're entitled to." He's going to go to one of these severance calculators that everybody pulls, and it's going to be within the range. If he thinks he was treated fairly, he may not even go to see a lawyer. Now, let's assume he goes to see a lawyer and he goes to see you, Chris.
24 months.
Yeah, right. No, that's the M firm. You guys are more realistic. You may sit there and say, "Okay, this case may be worth 4 to 6 months. How much is my fee going to be?" My contingency fee is based on my improvement factor, as we all know. So, oh God, I'm going to do all this work and get another month or two and get $2,000. Forget it. If a guy like this walks in and says, "Oh, by the way, I got nothing," anybody would take his case. So by paying a decent amount by the employer, maybe the low end of reasonable notice, plaintiffs will have a feeling that they're not being screwed around often, or a lawyer is less willing to take it on because there's not enough money in it. And there's a couple of cases whose name I don't remember anymore, so don't ask, where this employer gave 10 months lump sum. And I think it was another one of our friends went out and sued. And the judge made a big point of saying, "You know what? I know I'm not to choose the notice period based on what the employer did, but I'm going to." And he found that 10 months was appropriate.
Right. That's what I think too. I think that there's some power in a reasonable offer, particularly if the employer can stomach. There's some power in paying down the claim if the employer is prepared to give working notice. What's your experience been with working notice, Rob? I'd love to hear some comments from a management perspective.
I think the hardest thing with working notice is getting the management side to actually agree to do it. I was just saying to someone yesterday, in almost every case, it's better for the company to give that working notice. If nothing else, they're getting work from the employee for their time as opposed to just paying it into.
Well, but what if he's incompetent? You want to keep an incompetent.
I said in almost every case, Barry. But that's exactly the issue that most employers say. Not even that they are incompetent, that as soon as they get their notice, they're going to stop working and they're going to be worth nothing, which, isn't always made out. Oftentimes people don't want to burn bridges. They don't want to get fired for cause once this notice has happened. So yeah, they're not going to work 100%, but maybe they're working 75%. You're still paying for 75% of the work as opposed to 0% of the work. But that fear that people are just going to not do any work is what makes a lot of employers decide, no, we're not going to do it. It's a different thing with an employee who you don't have any faith in. Yeah, you don't want them around anymore. Um, but I want to go back to Barry what you said, which is that the offers can never be considered, because I was actually just reading a case yesterday, so I have it available, which is Kennedy versus Kingston area taxi, and in that case, the judge actually did make a big deal about an offer that was made by the employer, which was basically they made a few offers, and the final one they added one extra day of vacation pay as sort of the final piece in the offer, and the judge said this is just an insult. So there can be cases where a judge will somehow get that offer information and look at it, even if it is
Well,
rare.
but I question whether the plaintiff objected. A lot of counsel don't understand the law on offers. I think it would be. I think if you had objected, saying you can only look at what you paid. There was a case a while back, uh, from a large computer company, um, which routinely only pays the ESA. So they paid the
Sure.
ESA, and maybe his ESAs were 6 months or something. They go to court, and defense counsel stands up and says, "Well, we think the notice period is 18 months," and plaintiff's counsel says, "I think it should be 24." And the judge turned to defense counsel and said, "So your client thinks 18 months is the proper notice period?" "Yes." "Why in God's name haven't they paid it? How dare you stand there and say you admit it's 18, but you only paid them 6?" And they just plummeted. They just. And that's
Well, that was one of the cases in Kondaj too, Barry, where the defendant had agreed that the notice period was 3 months,
but then didn't pay it.
that the court pointed to, right? And I thought that was interesting, right? The as the court sort of was picking through the employer's case authorities, right? Underlying all of it was sort of this. In the tone of the judgment, I sort of took away that one, the court was unimpressed that the employer didn't seem to understand the second branch of the mitigation test, which is that they have to produce evidence of jobs that had the plaintiff applied to them, they would have found other employment, not just case authority, right? And the judge was really sort of critical of the authorities that they
Right.
chose, right, in distinguishing them. And so I thought that was interesting as well. But to come back, I want to really try to get my head around this idea that if the notice that is offered on termination is fair and reasonable, does that impact the outcome? And is the reliance on availability of alternative employment a crutch that courts can use to deal with litigation tactics that they don't care for? And should this case actually have been, I don't know, a 3 to 5 month case with damages for bad faith or post termination
Oh,
conduct?
was it? Well,
Thoughts,
it's not
guys?
bad. How was it bad faith? It's legitimate.
Well, they didn't provide a letter of reference. They didn't provide a letter of reference
Who's
when
the
requested.
employer that never employed
They
them?
paid ESA
Hold on.
minimums.
Who did?
They argued about who was the employer, notwithstanding that somebody terminated. And looking at the case, like, it was pretty obvious that Duca was the employer. Um, so like,
No.
they made the litigation necessary.
Who was supposed to give the letter of reference? The old co or the new co?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The
Huh.
the court said the new co is the employer, and I believe they said this was the first instance that it's been dealt with in a court case. So I don't know that necessarily I agree with you, Chris, that it's obvious considering it's never
Yeah.
been decided before. And
Fair
and if
enough.
it's the new co that's the employer and it's the old co who he worked for, then how does the new co not giving a letter of reference help? They were never his employer, right?
Right.
It's the old co that was the employer before termination. So I agree with Barry. Who's that letter to come from? And if it's supposed to come from the old co, then why does that go against the new co? Which apparently it did because the judge mentioned it.
Does the judge
Right.
actually comment on the fact that he didn't get a reference letter? I don't recall.
He does. It's in the decision. It's early on in the decision. And he not only does he say they didn't get a reference letter, but they didn't get a reference letter when it was requested. Yeah, it was paragraph 75. Neither Crossbridge nor Duca provided a letter of reference to assist Kondaj in his job search, despite his requests, plural, for one.
Well, presumably they should have whacked the old co with some damages for failure to give a letter of reference.
I don't know.
No,
I'm interested in the
it
thoughts.
makes no sense that the new co would be anyways, most, as we all know in the trade, how many companies give out reference lists anymore? It's so rare to see a company who'll give out a reference letter these days.
And why is that, Barry? Like, why not give a letter of reference? In the same way, why not give some working notice,
Because
right?
20 years ago, somebody gave a seminar, or there was some case in the US where somebody got sued for giving a false reference. You cannot be sued for giving an honest reference. It's just,
Right.
and they'll say every company, it's our policy. Ask them for a copy of their policy. They never have a policy. Now, ironically enough, that failure to give a reference can be very helpful to a plaintiff. Many times in a mediation, like the guy's fired for, quasi cause or pretty close to cause. The plaintiff wants an agreement from the employer that they will not give a reference because if asked what they think about the guy. So it's kind of, anyways, reference letters are kind of useless. Anybody stupid enough to hire somebody based on what the HR manager says in a letter who was never the guy's manager, it's kind of, I think it's antiquated, this idea of a reference letter. It sounds more like something out of Downton Abbey where the butler gets fired and he has to get a reference or something. We all know BS anyways.
Rob, thoughts on reference letters?
I think employers should try to give them as soon as they can.
Agreed.
I've recently started telling employers, except when the person's really bad, give that reference letter with the response to the demand letter. Here's a reference letter. Here's some jobs that we found that are similar to ours. Go use them to try to get a job. That you're not going to get the court saying they didn't have a reference letter. You're not going to get someone saying there were no jobs available because we've just given you some that you can find. That's 2 points that commonly go against employers that you can knock off right off the bat. It's not going to hurt you to give that reference letter, and it may actually help your employee get another job within 3 months instead of it taking them 11, and then you're not in this situation.
I used to do a little variation on that trick when I acted for employers. I would offer a reference letter in the termination letter, knowing that they would forget about it. Then plaintiff's counsel would argue that they failed to give a reference letter. And on discovery, I said, we offered one. You never actually asked for it. And that would make the lawyer. But I agree with you. Just give it out. Be nice.
Yeah, my practice is to include it with the
Yeah, I agree.
termination
Yes.
package where I can, because it actually gives the employee some comfort.
Right.
One of the first things an employee is thinking is, are these guys going to get in my way in my job search, right? And so if you slip a letter of reference or a letter of employment confirmation in with your package and confirm that you'll give oral references consistent with that, I find that calms a lot of that fear down. And the only other thing I'll say about reference letters is I do think they're important. Or at least letters of employment confirmation are important because in the US, many employers require 2 letters from your last 2 employers confirming your length of service before they will complete the hire. And so pulling back that letter or failing to respond to that request may actually prevent the employee from mitigating their damages. I think, it's a no-brainer if you get the request. All right, I'm going to dive into the part that Sarah would normally do, and then I think we've got another issue we're going to look at in a moment here. So in the decision, the court cited a report from July 2024 that described the state of the condominium market in the Greater Toronto Area as being in a state of economic lockdown, with conditions deteriorating to levels not seen in decades. That's pretty dramatic. The decision states that it took the plaintiff 11 months to find new employment, and that although the amount of time it takes a plaintiff to find reemployment is not the determining factor, because it would place excessive weight on the plaintiff's subjective circumstances, at the same time, the underlying purpose of common law notice is to give the terminated employee financial support during the period that it takes to find a new position. The particular circumstances of the job market a plaintiff faces cannot therefore be ignored. So the court concluded that Kondaj had fulfilled his duty to mitigate his damages and emphasized the impact of the condominium market on his difficulty in securing new employment. Barry, you shared your thoughts about reasonable notice and the job circumstance. So we've already talked about that. So I guess the other part I really wanted to talk about today was the mitigation aspect, right? And we've touched on a little bit, 170 job applications, and yet the employer was still critical. Barry and Rob, uh, I've heard mitigation described as the last gasp of the employer, the only argument of the employer, the Hail Mary. Um, and the truth is, the first part of the test, I can understand how an employer might be successful in demonstrating that an employee who really just hasn't looked, right, has no evidence of making a search. I can understand how you might succeed there. But do you have any insight on how an employer can succeed on the second branch of the test? Evidence demonstrating that had the employee looked, they would have found employment. And maybe I'll let Rob go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think this case is a great example of the difficulty that an employer could have doing that. Imagine it was the flip side. The employer brought forward 170 cases that this guy didn't apply for and said if he had, he would have gotten one of these jobs. Well, in this case, the guy did apply for 170 and didn't get the job. So, how are we going to prove that he would have gotten the job? I would have thought 170 jobs that the employer can show, that's probably going to be enough to say he would have gone one of these. But I could see counsel on the other side turning around and saying, well, here's this case where the guy did and he didn't get it. What's your proof that he would have? And I think it's difficult for the employer to show it unless they can like find one of these people who was doing a job and bring them in as evidence to say, yes, we would have hired him if we'd had him. And like, no one's going to do that.
Right. That's, for me, that's the issue, is how do you evidence the second test? Barry, you have
Well,
any?
there's two comments. There was a case in Alberta the other day that awarded 26 months to this guy, and he did zero to look for a job. Nothing. And the court gave him 26 months. Now, one of the rationales was, it was actually almost humorous. Sometimes you think judges are living on another planet. I don't get it. They said the employer who fired him, I worked for a car dealership. He said one of the reasons we got rid of him is because he had old style management. That was his personal opinion why they got rid of him. The judge turns that around and says, well, if this guy thought he was old style management, then every new employer would think the same, and therefore, what's the point of looking for a job? It was like absurd. The only case I recall where it actually punished the guy was a case out in BC. Person worked for one of the airlines, Air Canada or something. I think that was the job actually he got paid to work as opposed to not getting paid to work. So that's a comment on flight attendants. And there was evidence somehow that he was fired from Air Canada, but WestJet actually offered the person a job and he said no thanks. So I think that's the only one. It's an impossible test. You have to prove that if the guy had done something, he would have got the job. You could never prove that. He might have got an interview. He
Well,
might have been a third person. You can't prove. So it almost makes mitigation. Why do we even bother talking about it anymore? Now, here's another thing about mitigation. When we talk about the test being how long does it take the person to get a job, we know that even in this case, it took 11 months to get a job, but he found 10 was reasonable, right? Just do the reverse. If 10 was reasonable, but he got a job in 3 months, what would he have got? 3 months.
right. That's the crux of this
So
case,
Exactly.
Barry. So there
it
we are,
hurts you
right?
if I mean, if we really thought how long does it take a reasonable person to get a job, then shouldn't the only question be, did he act reasonably? Yeah, well, that's how long it took to get a job. So we create this bogeyman of the theoretical person, make up the number, which is really all we ever do in wrongful dismissal actions. We just rely on precedent. No one has ever done a study, as far as I know, how long does it actually take the average person to get a job. I've never seen any evidence on that. We've
And
created this thing about Bardol, and it becomes a self-sustaining animal that really has no scientific basis to it at all. And we're
I think
just
the other problem you've got is what happens if you have two people doing the same job who are fired on the same day. One of them gets one of those few jobs that are out there after 3 months. The other one, it takes 10 months. What's the reasonable notice period in that situation?
correct.
You're going to say, well, it was 3 because he got one, or is it 10? And,
Because in reality, we don't actually look at that. We look
yeah.
at the hard.
But that's what's fascinating to me, right? Because if the new job pays less than the old job, you're entitled to the
Correct.
difference, right? And so, like, being able to objectively pin the number is important, even in circumstances where the employee finds new work quickly. But Rob, I think you've hit the nail right on the head. Same employee, same role, same employer, same industry. Both go out to look. One finds work quickly, one finds work not so quickly. Why would the notice periods be different?
Exactly. And from an employer perspective, they don't have the benefit of hindsight of how long it's going to take the people. So from a practical perspective, we don't want people to have to wait until a year or 2 years down the line to know what's the right amount that they should be giving people when they terminate. We want to have some predictability so we can say to our clients, this is what you should pay this person, and then avoid having to go through a court process. And when we're doing a retroactive look at, it took him 10, 11 months, so we should give him 10. That's not helpful for an employer who's trying to be good at the front end, to say, we've had this person here for this long. This is how old they are. This is the type of job that they had. This is how much we should give them, because they don't have that benefit of hindsight, and they shouldn't have to have the benefit of hindsight to be able to know how much they should be paying these people.
Well, the case law actually says you're supposed to be able to ascertain the notice period on the date of termination, and you're not supposed to look at events that occur afterwards.
So let's not
There's
look
no,
at the job market and the
I
fact
know
that it took them
there were
10
those
months.
COVID cases, and the COVID bump only worked if you were fired during COVID. If you were fired a month before COVID, you didn't get the bump. If you were fired a month after COVID, you did. Well, of course, that's ridiculous because,
Yeah, that made no sense
well,
to
it
me.
does if you accept the premise that you you have to make that decision on the day of termination.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
it doesn't make sense if you say how long does it take to get a job because they both were stuck during COVID. But again,
exactly.
this inconsistency.
They're both employees are looking in the same devastated job
But I
market.
think if you're
I
doing it from what should the employer be giving them, it sort of does make sense, because before COVID, no one thought that the job market was going to disappear.
Right.
I think the COVID circumstances, though, do give us a great insight, right? This is the crux of the Kondaj case for me, right? Is that if the employers had, instead of arguing amongst themselves, saying, not me, you, oh, not me, you, if the employers had just said, well, it's probably one of us, put their heads together, come up with a package or an offer with a letter of reference and some working notice, does Mr. Kondaj on 3.5 years of service ever get 10 months?
Yeah, mediation. The worst mediations are when there's two defendants because they spend more
Yeah.
time arguing about who's paying than what the plaintiff gets. I can't stand working with two. They're fighting with each other and they'll say things like, well, I'll put in 50 if he puts in 50. If he
Yeah.
only puts in 40, I'll put in 40. And you're sitting there saying, what difference does it make? Get this case settled. So it's bad for defendants.
Most of the time you're having on a sale of a business, the companies are friends and they'll say, okay, we're not going to keep this guy, let's figure out, sort of, we'll take off some money or we'll do this in the transaction, we'll figure out how to deal with this person. Here they lost the contract, so the two companies dislike each other and neither of them wants to pay. So that probably factored into why he didn't get something. If they had been on the same page, someone would
Yeah.
have said, let's split this and pony it up together or something. But because they probably don't like each other, neither of them wanted to pay, which
Did he
led
have
to,
to choose between the two? Or is it, you
I
let
don't
him,
I
I
don't know
mean,
what was I
as
don't know what was pleaded in so far as I hadn't really done a deep dive into whether there was a common employer argument or a successor employer argument
no,
or
no, it wasn't. No, it
yeah.
was a succession. But couldn't the argument be, well, then you're both liable? You clearly let the guy go because you
yeah.
lost the contract. Just because you lost the contract doesn't mean you're off scot free. You could have employed him somewhere else. But
But I
he
think the
most
judge did do an analysis of why he thought it would give incentive to the new code to not hire people if they weren't on the hook and the old codes were, especially in these situations where you're not getting anything from the old co in return. It's sort of a double whammy against the old co, right? They're losing the contract and they're on the hook for all of the people who the new company has decided not to hire.
right. No, I think he wanted to be consistency because under the ESA, it's clearly Nuco who's responsible, and he didn't want to create a situation. I was talking to some lawyer yesterday and said, "Oh, it's theoretically wrong." So you should get the ESAs from Nuco and you should sue the old co. Like, really? So I think it's one of those things you just need to know. Uh, I think he didn't want to have an inconsistency between the statute and the common law. And he's right. It's if the whole purpose of this statute was to avoid what happened in the building sector before. A new company would come in, fire everybody, or lower their salaries, and it just kept on going to the bottom, to the bottom, to the bottom. Remember, most of the people covered by this legislation are very low wage people. They're waiters, they're service. They're not. This guy's kind of unusual in it. So I think he was. It's the he. I don't even know, but the judge. It was important to be consistent with the legislation.
But I think if one of them had ponied up the money at the front end and said, okay, this guy's been with us for 3.5 years, let's give him 3 to 4 months,
Yeah.
he's going to go
Save
to
yourself
some
the
lawyer
cost
and
of a
say, is
trial,
this a
right?
good deal? And the lawyer's probably going to
So,
say,
Oh my God!
you know, it's
Treat
not bad. It's not
how's
worth your
this
time
for
to
legal
fight it.
principle? Treat people fairly, and you might avoid
I
legal
think
Exactly.
Rob actually wrote that in a post on LinkedIn. Yeah, I read that and I chuckled to myself because one, it was true, and two, it was timely.
I did.
So I want to ask one more question. We're coming to the end of our time, and I just want to get your thoughts. So Howard Levitt, in one of his recent posts,
Or who?
Howard Levitt, a relatively
Or
famous
never mind.
columnist of the I think it's the Financial Post, wrote that availability of alternative employment was the most important Bardolph factor, right? And I don't know if I agree or disagree, but do you think we're going to see more cases and more of these pleadings about extreme economic conditions as we move through this trade war cycle and as we move through what looks like is going to be a recessionary economy? It looks like it's going to be a little bit deeper and a little bit longer than people might like. Thoughts? I'll go to Barry first.
Yeah, I think that should be the main. That should be the main issue. But you have to be careful about availability. So here, give me an example here. You have two people. One's a vice president, and one's a clerk. The clerk applies for evidence is presented that there were 100 clerk jobs available on any given day, whereas the vice president job only had 5 available every day. So we automatically say, oh, well, the clerk has way more availability. No, he doesn't, because there may be 100 clerk jobs available that day, but there are 1,000 unemployed clerks. So mathematically, he's got a 1 in 10 chance of getting a job. The vice president, although there's only 5 positions available that day, there may only be 2 available candidates. So he has a much better chance. So you can't just look at how many postings there are, because it's a relationship between how many people are looking for the lesser job. And we never have access to those statistics. So availability is a great idea, but how do you prove it? And they don't. They just sort of say, oh, well, the steel industry is rough, so I'm assuming it's this, or this industry is better, or they don't know. There's no scientific basis. I've never seen a lawyer present any statistical evidence regarding availability of employment.
Okay. Rob, thoughts on availability of employment?
I mean, you can definitely show statistical evidence on available of condos, though, and that may be enough for the judge, like they were here. Um, but no, but I
Mhm.
take your point. I think though, I'm already seeing in my practice more and more people talking about the tariffs extending the notice periods and people relying on that. And I think it's right. If it's something that you can use, try to use it. And we're going to see more people trying to use it as this continues, which is going to mean that the court's going to be looking at it more.
Well, for me, my concern is that the litigation becomes a lifeboat, right? So I have a reasonable offer on termination of working notice of 3 months, but I know from Kondaj, if I go out and look for alternative employment and it takes me 11 months and I plead 10, I might get 10, right? And so my concern is that, plaintiffs, sophisticated plaintiffs and plaintiffs who are following along, perhaps listening to this podcast, are going to say, hey, the smart move here is to just go look. I have 2 years to bring my claim, right? The limitation period for wrongful dismissal claims is 2 years, right? Why settle today when if my search turns out to be longer, I can lean into this argument. And that's my real concern, is that, the more that it becomes, the more that availability of alternative employment, or the length of the search becomes a factor in the decision, the more reward there is for the plaintiff who just engages in a lengthy search. So,
And lives on what in the meantime, Chris? Cat food?
well, I hear you, Barry, but if they don't find work, they don't find work. Like, it's not like they're not
No,
looking.
but most
But
people,
it's not like they're
but
not
most,
looking, right? This guy, Kondaj,
no,
170
I know that.
applications.
I know. I'm just saying, if there's an offer out there, but if there's a first of all, you can't offer working notice. No, only a fool would sign a release on working notice. You can just say to the employer, and an employer can't ask for a release on working notice. I don't think. You just have to offer. You say, "I'm employing you. I'm giving you 3 months
Yeah,
notice," and you hope the guy
yeah.
quits. That's really what I'm looking
I
for.
don't know if I entirely agree there, Barry. I think that you can ask for a release in an employment agreement, and you can have a release in an employment agreement, and
Oh,
you
that's
could bury
right,
into your
but
termination section working notice, or the right to give working notice. Although it's, might be, I don't know if that's a breach of the ESA, which requires that the ESA payments be paid lump sum, right? Like, there's always some tension there around that.
well, only if you're not giving
Yeah, yeah.
working
Yeah.
notice. If you give it,
So, but I think I can conceive of how you would set that up, and I can also see why many employees would take working notice, right?
I find it almost never did.
Yeah.
They hated it.
I know they
First of all,
hate
you
it, but
don't
if
want
you're looking from a position of employment, your ability to negotiate a higher compensation package with your new employer, who thinks they're stealing you away from that job you're in, is much better
Exactly.
than when you're looking from home, right? So, and I tell
It,
my clients that.
I used to tell my clients that too, but I'm not sure it was true.
Why do you say that?
And
Why
they
do you say
hate
that?
because they didn't look for a job when they had a job.
Uh,
Because looking for a job is a horrible experience, and they just put it off. So you give the guy 6 months working notice, he never sends a letter out until the sixth
well,
month.
all right.
So it's not it's counterproductive.
but now, Barry, we're getting those 3 days of working
What's that
notice
one?
leave. The new legislation coming out under Working for Workers 7. There's going to be 3 days of leave that you can take
During the
during
unpaid.
the
How
working notice.
generous.
I know.
How
Well,
how
well.
generous. You mean of the 8 weeks working notice, you can say, "Boss, I want to have 3 off and not get paid."
Well, and be
But
allowed to
but
if you have no vacation days left or whatnot.
So you can tell your employer you're looking for other work, take a leave under the act, and if they turn around and terminate you, you would allege reprisal for exercising a statutory right under the
It,
act
it's when you're on working notice you have
when you're
this.
on working notice. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
in fact, I mean that I understand when I used to do working notice letters, I would always make it clear it's working notice, but this is the purpose of this is to help you get a job.
Yeah.
If you need time off for an interview, it will be granted and all that sort of stuff. You want to make it sound reasonable. You can't just load up. Anyways, I never had a client who did working notice twice. Put it that way.
But you had
I
repeat
would tell them
customers.
about it. I would tell them about it. They'd try it and they say that was stupid. Well, told you. Here's the example I use for working notice. You're on a business trip and you're supposed to come home on Wednesday and you come home on Monday night and your wife's in bed with your next door neighbor. She's going to divorce you, but you have to live in the house for the next 8 weeks and he gets to stay there too. It is very uncomfortable for working notice. It is, I wouldn't want to do it. You fired me, you want to get rid of me, I'm out of here. The employer doesn't want to see the person. They poison the work environment because they tell everyone they've been fired. It's a nightmare. Working notice, unless it's a mass, it's like GM and everyone gets 3 months notice or something. To give working notice is not very effective for anybody, in my opinion.
All right, Rob, thoughts? I'll give you last comment.
um, I would say that I definitely don't think people enjoy the working notice, but I agree going out into that market, having that job that you can say you're doing as opposed to not. Usually people think that it's better for their job prospects, and I would probably think that employers would rather hire someone who's working than someone who they're wondering why did that previous employer fire them.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of telling the employee to lie to the new employer, right? Oh yeah, I'm working as a marketing manager, and then they find out later you're on working notice, and they accuse you of misleading them on the job. I never would have hired you if I knew you were unemployed. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know if you're misleading if you're on working notice, but I take your point, Barry.
Where are you? Oh, I'm presently employed at ABC. I won't be on Friday, but
Well,
it's a hell of a way to start off. It's like going out on a date and not telling her you're still married. You know,
fair enough.
I mean, the process of getting a divorce. I think it's misleading. It's almost intentionally misleading. I used to tell my clients the same thing. It's easier to get a job and all that sort of stuff. I don't know if it's true.
Okay, wow.
Well,
All right. On that grudging and grumbling note, I'm going to bring this episode to a conclusion. That's today's discussion. I want to thank you guys for a great conversation. I think we really did get right down to the nub of the conundrum in this particular case. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you like the episode, please subscribe, leave a review. If you have a case you want us to discuss, or you'd like to share your own story of workplace drama, and we love workplace drama here, email us at watercoolerjustice@gmail.com. Until next time,